Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Aaron Glass, a professor here at Bard Graduate Center and a member of the Faculty Planning Committee for the Cultures of Conservation Initiative, generously funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. On behalf of our director, Susan Weber, and our dean, Peter Miller, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's panel discussion on Indigenous Ontologies of Active Matter, and I'll get to what that might possibly mean in a minute. I'd also like to thank our Cultures of Conservation postdoctoral fellow, Alicia Boswell, and my colleague, Laura Minsky, for helping organize this event. For those joining us online from other territories, welcome to you as well, and please join the discussion afterwards at #BardGradCenterTV. Before I introduce our eminent speakers, I would like to ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenni Lenape and other indigenous peoples of this territory, who for countless generations have gathered on and around the island of Mannahatta to make their homes, their livelihoods, and their belongings. From the start of our conservation initiative, it was important that the pluralization of cultures in the project title signal the topical breadth of our approach. At the most consistent level, this has entailed bridging the culture of academia and the culture of the museum through the close attention to the material properties of objects as method of both research and conservation. But we also want to stress that diverse peoples of the world bring their own cultural values and orientations to the material realm, their own fundamental notions of what the object is and isn't, what its proper relationship to persons might be, what factors might contribute to protocols surrounding its preservation, if indeed it ought to be preserved at all. We are now entering the second 5-year phase of the project with a new thematic focus on active matter, a concern with the ways in which materials, or at least some materials, are characterized by a distinct lack of stasis, and what implication that has for traditional conservation practice and material culture research. Our institutional partners in this endeavor are a material science research unit at the Humboldt Center for Cultural Techniques of the Humboldt University in Berlin, and the Innovative Art Conservation Department of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Together, we launched this phase with a symposium back in November, which those of you who didn't attend can stream online. And we'll develop it over the next 2 years with 4 working groups here at Bard Graduate Center, each responsible for programming 1 semester of activities. We begin tonight by focusing on Indigenous Ontologies, continue this fall with historical precedents, in spring 2019 with perspectives from materials science, and wrap up with philosophical considerations in fall 2019. The whole project will culminate in a co-curated, multivocal, transdisciplinary exhibition, circa 2022. So stay tuned. Now, you may be asking yourselves, when we talk about active matter, what are we really talking about? And I assure you, we ask ourselves that on a daily basis. That's partially why we're here tonight. Are we talking about molecules in motion visible under a microscope or some other tool, or the capacity of objects to act as effective agents in the world? Is object even the right term, or do we need a more capacious language to avoid entrenched Western dualisms? What do we, as scholars, curators, conservators, makers, and custodians, do with museum collections that need to be fed, talked to, or cleansed with purifying smoke? To what and to whom do we imagine the matter of things being intrinsically and actively related, especially over time? For whom, why, when, and how do we conserve active matter? And how is the matter imbricated in lasting genealogies of knowledge, practice, and affiliation? The answers to these questions, you'll be happy to know, are, in order, yes, both, it depends, and it's complicated. And here I want to call attention to the image on screen, which shows a man sharing a hongi, the customary Maori practice of greeting through the exchange of breath, with his ancestor Pukaki, still in his wooden shipping crate, upon the latter's return from the Auckland Museum to his local kin group in Rotorua, New Zealand. Here we might reflect also on the origins of the term repatriation as the return of a citizen often displaced in war to homelands after forced displacements. For the purpose of this working group, we use the term ontologies to refer to culture-specific theories of being. According to originating communities, what are the items in museum collections fundamentally? What are their essential identities as certain kinds of beings in relation with other kinds of beings, be these other objects, persons, or other than human agents, as well as in relation to specific cultural knowledges? In the realm of material science, how can we move from concerns about inherent vice and the prevention of decay to recognition for, if not restoration of, the intrinsic capacity for growth and transformation? The ultimate goal of our working group over the next 5 years will be to examine the ramifications for conservation work as well as exhibition practice that follow from taking seriously indigenous ontologies of the object as an assemblage of active matter, cultural knowledge, and persistent relations. With this goal in mind, I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speakers, all of whom have a lot of experience wrestling with such complex questions in the context of transforming the relationship between mainstream conservation practice and the indigenous peoples whose cultural patrimony museums have long collected, preserved, and exhibited under largely Western scientific, aesthetic, and philosophical paradigms. Our first speaker is Jamie Jacobs, a Tonawanda Seneca historian, ritual custodian, educator, and quill worker, who is also collections assistant for the Rock Foundation at the Rochester Museum and Science Center, where he helps document and care for the extensive Haudenosaunee collection. Jamie will speak about wampum as material, media, and memory. Next will be Rose Evans, materials conservator and heritage consultant of Te Ati Awa and European descent, who has worked for many of New Zealand's museums, art galleries, and heritage sites, and who's the founding director of the Object Lab consulting firm in Auckland. And I should also say, she's also on the cast of a very cool reality TV show in New Zealand called Heritage Rescue, where small teams of museum professionals go to rural communities to rehouse and re-exhibit collections, sort of a cross between Antiques Roadshow and, I don't know, Flip This House or something like that. If we ever got to a point of having a reality TV show like that here, we'd be farther along the way. Finally, we'll hear from Sanchita Balachandran, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Near Eastern Studies and Associate Director of the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum, where she was formerly both a curator and a conservator, who will take us from the South Pacific, even farther west, or I don't know, is it east? I guess it depends which way you're facing, to speak about the origins of professional conservation in India, with particular attention to ancient Hindu bronzes. Each will speak for about 20 minutes, after which we will all come sit up here and enjoy a discussion with one another and with you all. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speakers. Jamie.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Jamie Jacobs, and I'm sorry to say that I am not a TV star. But I can do my best tonight to supply and relay traditional and experience information from the community to you, and hopefully that it will be helpful to you in the future in whatever field of study that you are chasing after. So the title of my presentation tonight is called The Orator's Dilemma, Wampum as Material, Media, and Memory. I was born and raised in a Native American community in upstate New York, just outside of Buffalo, in the city of Rochester. Since the day I was born, I was immersed in the Iroquoian ways of culture, speaking, song, and dance. My mother's side of the family, they hold titles, what we call keepers of the faith. And the responsibilities of these individuals are to ensure their survival and to perpetuate the religious ceremonies and songs and dances of our people. My father's side, also, his grandmother also was a keeper of the faith. She was the first language speaker, and she didn't speak English until she actually went to third grade. And she only made it as far as sixth grade because her father insisted that her culture was more important than Western education at the time. So she lived to be 96, and she passed away in 2010. To the Iroquois people and other groups in the Northeast around the Great Lakes, wampum has always played this important role within the culture. And it has many different faces to the people. It plays all kinds of different roles, political, ceremonial, aesthetic. People make jewelry. Our ancestors thought that this material was very important because of where it was, because of where it originates, which is in water. So every ancestor on the planet found the importance of water very early on, because nothing on this earth, pretty much everything that's living, cannot survive without some level of water. You have to have it. It supplies your breath. So in our language, the word for wampum is, we don't say wampum, we say wutukoat, which just basically translates to shell bead. This word is not used for anything else. It's not used for glass bead. It's not used for ceramic bead. It's only used for wampum, any kind of bead made from wampum. So in the early stages of wampum, my ancestors, they started off with very primitive tooling. So wampum has evolved in our culture in physical shape, size, the methods of creating it. So it kind of starts off very large, and then it takes on this form of being discoidal. These beads that you're looking at were excavated from known historical Seneca sites from the 1550s circa up to the 1660s. So beads at that time were made and used in all these different ways. They were used for ceremonies, they were used for aesthetics, they were worn around the neck, they were highly valued. The bigger beads were actually manufactured right in this area, and then the shells, sometimes as finished products, as beads, were traded inland to the Iroquois peoples, and then finally into the Seneca peoples who lived in Western New York, or what is now known as Western New York. That also made them very valuable. So not only of the fact that they originated in water, they were living beings, just the fact that they physically had to travel throughout different lands, throughout the hands of different peoples. They were created by the hands of peoples. That's made them very, also made them very valuable. Political. Amongst the Haudenosaunee, that's the traditional name for the Iroquois peoples. Haudenosaunee roughly translates to they have extended the house. That's literally what that means. We don't refer to ourselves as Iroquois. We don't refer to ourselves as Senecas, Mohawks, Onondagas, etc. We use the traditional names. So the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee, long ago, oral tradition says that when the formation of this unity of the 5 original nations formed, this individual visited these 5 nations because they were in this perpetual act of warfare. Everybody was at each other's throats, and this individual come along and he preached these principles of peace, power, and friendship. And to convey his message to the people, he brought and used wampum beads so that when he talked about these words to the people, that they would know that what he was telling them was the truth. So the shell has two colors, purple and white. So sometimes they often refer to it as the quahog shell. So in Iroquoian beliefs, the white shell was looked upon as peace. It was looked upon as the friendship. It was looked upon as a symbol of power. The purple beads that were produced from the purple part of the shell were looked at as darkness, people who were suffering from death, people who were suffering from these stresses, either by warfare or by death or family disputes. Purple wampum beads were used to convey that message. So we refer to this person only as the peacemaker. He has a traditional name, but in oral tradition, that traditional name is only to be mentioned when the laws of the Haudenosaunee are recited to the people. So I respect that rule, so I only refer to him as the peacemaker. So the peacemaker, in oral tradition, he come to our people roughly around 1,000 years ago. And along with his ally, some of you probably have heard the name Hiawatha, and not to be confused with the poet Longfellow. That's a different Hiawatha. So in Seneca, his traditional name is Hayewata, which translates to he keeps them awake. So Hayewata and the peacemaker, they come together, and Hayewata was in this perpetual grief because his daughters had suffered homicide. They were killed. They suffered the effects of this perpetual warfare amongst the people. So he became a wanderer of the forest, and every time he went to a place, every time he saw a tree, every time he saw a sun rise and he saw the sun set, every time the darkness came to the earth, that's all he could think about were his daughters, and they weren't no longer living. So in his mind, he's thinking, and he's conveying these thoughts out to the environment. And he finally comes to this reasoning where he says, if any individual that I come upon who is suffering the same sorrow and grief, he says, I will console them, and I will use wampum beads to do that. So he meets the peacemaker, and the peacemaker is visiting the 5 nations. And the peacemaker, with his powers of thought, and I guess sometimes today in English we refer to it as ESP, he knows exactly what Hiawatha's thinking, because Hiawatha, again, he's you could just read his body language, and you could read his mind, and you can read his thoughts. So the peacemaker automatically, when they meet, he says to Hayewata, he says, I know exactly what you're thinking, so I'm going to console you. And he too brings these wampum strings, and he says, now I wipe away the tears, and I use a wampum string to convey that idea, so that now you can see all the things around you. So then he picks up another wampum string, and he says, the grief has gotten stuck into your ears. You can't hear anything. That's not the way our Great Spirit has made it to be. So now I use this wampum, and I unstuff the grief from your ears. Now you can hear. Now you can hear the birds. You can hear the people talking amongst you. So then he picks up another wampum string, and he says, grief has gotten stuck into your throat, into your esophagus, to the point where you can't breathe. So he says, now I use wampum string. He says, with this string of beads, I remove that grief from your throat. Now you can breathe. Now you can taste these good things in life. So he does this to Hayewata, he removes the yellow spots in his stomach, and he prepares this drink. And with another wampum string, he says, now I clear away the things that have come to cause this grief that has the effects of your stomach being twisted. So he does this, and he says, I also replace the sun with this wampum string. You have lost the sun. You can't see it anymore. So now with the wampum string, I replace the sun. I bring you out of darkness. So Haye Wata and the peacemaker, they visit the 5 nations, they bring them together, and then that's the formation of the League, of what we now know in history as the Iroquois Confederacy. So this ritual is still performed today. So we have women leaders amongst our people, and we have male leaders. In English, we call them chiefs, but in our language, we say Hoyani, which translates to he is of goodness. We have female leaders. So when you talk about women's rights in Western culture, and the women have the right to vote, the women have the same rights as men. This has only been achieved in Western thought, within the last 50 years. But in Haudenosaunee culture, the women have always had a voice. They've always had this symbol of authority, and it was brought upon by the peacemaker in the form of wampum. So a chief, when he's elected as a leader, he's elected for life, and his symbol, he has what we call deer antlers. So when the peacemaker stood up these Confederacy chiefs and he placed these symbolic symbols of authority upon their head as deer antlers, he says this wampum string will represent the symbol of the deer antlers. So every chief amongst the Confederacy of the Iroquois, they have a white string of wampum. And the clan mother keeps that white string of wampum for him on his behalf. He also has a short string of purple wampum, so that when his time comes to step off the earth, the clan mother uses that string of purple wampum as a message to the rest of the Confederacy that she has lost her relative, her uncle. That's how we refer to the chiefs, our uncles. So throughout history, to the Iroquois peoples, to the Haudenosaunee, wampum also is a reminder. They're mnemonic devices to remember these stories, to remember the histories, because we didn't have a written language amongst our people. We didn't have any kind of orthography. We didn't have any kind of alphabet amongst our people. My ancestors certainly had the intelligence to do so if they chose, but they went the route of that when you two human beings speak to one another, you gain not only the words that they're telling you, but you gain their trust. You get to know who they are. You get to know, you get to gain respect for one another if you interact with this other person. So when they deliver a message, they use a wampum string. Wampum has been, these beads, they've been woven into these belts. Europeans, when they first arrived here and they saw our people witnessing councils, they saw these long rectangular wampum, things made of wampum, and they said that resembles a belt. But not to be confused with a belt that holds up your pants. That's not what we use wampum belts for. So they actually start off these wampum belts. The metaphorical interpretation of belts actually starts off as mats. Mats are people wove from bulrush and cattails. So when they wove these cattail and these bulrush mats, they had comfort. So they wove these belts of wampum also to comfort the minds of the people, to convey stories and to lock them in for generations to come, to be used as mnemonic devices. This is my great-great-grandfather. He was a Tonawanda Seneca chief. His name was Edward Black Squirrel, and his Seneca name was Guyente, which means out in the middle of the field. The word for the state of Kentucky, it's actually pronounced Guyantake, which means out in the field. That's actually where the name originates from. So in 1936, when the photograph was taken of my great-great-grandfather, in his hands, he's holding short strands of wampum. And what he's doing is he's visiting the different communities and he's relaying a message to them. And he's inviting the people to this recitation of the Code of Handsome Lake, which is now the belief system of the Iroquois people. So what he's holding in his hand, he's holding these short strands of wampum tied to a stick. And in the Seneca language, we call them Yotnes Hadiyondakwa. So when we refer to these, we don't say Utgoat, even though they're made from Utgoat. We say Yotnes Hadiyondakwa. And what that translates to is she uses it to pull the arm. So the wampum is referred to as a her, because when he delivers the message, when my grandfather delivered the message and he invited them, he was using wampum to invite the people, or in a sense to pull their arm to the direction of which the meeting was going to take place, or the recitation. So it's tied to a stick. My ancestors, they didn't have daily calendars. So what they did was they counted moons. They counted the number of sleeps. So when they delivered this message of an invitation to a council meeting, they would say, this number of sleeps. When you get to the last number of sleeps, you should be starting your journey to the meeting on that last sleep. So what they would do is they would carve notches into the stick for the amount of sleeps. So on the first sleep, you break off the first notch. And then the second sleep, you break off the next notch until you're down to the very last notch. That tells you you should be on your way to the council meeting. Grand Council, to discuss political issues, they use the same object, Yotnis Hadion Dakwa, to invite the chiefs and the clan mothers to the council meeting. These are the condolence strings. These are the strings that I referred to at the beginning of my presentation. So as you can see, the string on the top, it's referred to in the language as Ogashat, which means the tears. So when the peacemaker come upon Hiawatha, who was in this constant state of grief, he removed the tears from his eyes using the wampum string. So metaphorically, he removed these tears and he used the wampum. So just like you yourself, if you come upon a person, or even parents who have children and your kids come to you looking for compassion because they have tears in their eyes, that's one of the first things you do is you comfort them and then you wipe those tears away. So when the clan mother loses her chief, her opposite leader, she has these tears. So even today we still use the wampum metaphorically to remove these tears. The second string is onta, which means ear, to remove the grief from the ear. So the third one is what we call the yagonya dogan, and what that means is her esophagus has become like forked, like split. So they use wampum to metaphorically remove that lump in your throat. And then it continues on. So all in all, when the Confederacy was formed and the peacemaker and Hiawatha finished and they conducted this ceremony, they ended up with 15 strings. So we have the council seat. The council seat becomes covered in red stains because the chief has not survived. So what they do is they metaphorically wipe away those red stains of blood of the council seat so that when the new leader comes in, he's on a clean slate. So the sky, right? When a person suffers grief, they lose their sky. So in our language, we say, "Wa'agojo yahton," and that's literally what that means. It says her sky has become lost. So now we replace the sky, and we use wampum to do that. So the peacemaker and his ally, Hayewata, formed the unity of the 5 Iroquois nations, and they use wampum as the foundation symbol for these governing principles: peace, power, and righteousness. So this is an artist's interpretation from my community. His name was Ernest Smith. And Hayewata and the peacemaker, what they're doing is that they've come to this leader amongst the Onondaga people named Tadodaho. He kind of represents the mythical figure of Medusa. So the snakes are also symbols, because this man's mind was in such a way that he did not promote peace. He was against it. So the snakes were a metaphor for these negative thoughts that were just spewing from his mind. And anybody who came close to him, the snakes would latch on, and then they would become influenced by these negative ways. So using wampum and wampum beads, they metaphorically combed the snakes from Tadadaho's hair, meaning that this wampum had such power that it rid his mind of evil, or it combed the snakes from his hair. So Tadodaho, he became one of the main sachems of the Iroquois Confederacy at that time. And then after he was able to overcome, then the Onondaga Nation was brought in as the 5th final nation of the Iroquois Confederacy. So the peacemaker says, "You chiefs are like trees. You stand tall, your roots go deep into the earth, and your branches reach towards the heavens. The branch, your arms, will shelter your people, meaning you will protect them from the elements of life. Your roots will go deep into the earth, meaning that when you make a decision, you must look that far, what we call as 7 generations into the earth. And because if you make one wrong decision, that root goes deep into the earth, and that root might become rotten. Meaning that when you make a wrong decision, that's how far it'll affect. It'll affect the unborn generations of 7 generations to come." So he stood them in a circle, and he made them lock arms, and he says, "You're now the 50 sachems of the Iroquois Confederacy. And in the middle is the Tree of Peace. And on top of the Tree of Peace is a symbol of freedom and liberty, which is the eagle." So underneath the tree, they metaphorically uprooted the tree, and there in this dark chasm, they all threw in their weapons of war, no longer to be used against one another. So to tell that part of oral tradition and to remind the chiefs of their responsibility and the title that they hold, they made this symbol out of wampum. 2 strings on the outside interwoven with one another, representing the chiefs who stood in a circle and locked arms. Their roots going in towards, and their branches stretching out to shelter the people inside of the circle, reaching towards that Tree of Peace forever and for all time to come. So there's 50 strands, each representing the 50 sachems of the Iroquois Confederacy. So the Mohawk, they put up nine sachems, the Mohawk Nation. The Oneida Nation had 9. The Onondagas had 14. The Cayugas had 10, and the Senecas ended up with 8. In total, 50 sachems. So the Hiawatha Belt, representing the formation of the Confederacy of the original 5 nations of the Iroquois, also traditionally known as the Haudenosaunee. So these belts in the late 1800s were housed by a special person amongst the Onondaga Nation, who were dubbed firekeepers of the Grand Council of the Iroquois Confederacy. One man was in charge of keeping the records, as you would, meaning he was the wampum belt holder. He held the records. So an individual had come upon this person, and he says, "I hear you have relics." I like to collect relics, and I like to collect antiquities. He says, and I will buy these relics off you for this amount of dollars. That was tempting, especially in the late 1800s, because reservation life at that time, it was very hard and very difficult. So these wampum belts ended up in the hands of these collectors. So there they sat in museums for up until the 1980s, when the United States, with the participation of Native communities, passed the NAGPRA law, which basically states that any items of cultural patrimony, burial items, sacred human remains should be returned to the Native communities in which they were formed. So at the time, the question was raised, especially amongst the anthropologists, was, well, these objects, you no longer use them, so why do you want them back? They're just relics. But our people didn't look at them that way. They looked at them as, we look at them as living beings. Because of all their experience, because of the many hands of the generations that they've passed, the stories that they hold, it's just like a grandfather. Your grandfather has a lot of experience in life. He can see many ways into things. So when we refer to these belts, we refer to them as our grandfathers, and we treat them as such. We give them the respect that they deserve because of the things that they saw, because of the things that they have seen, and the stories that they tell to remind us of these guiding principles on which our Great Spirit has meant for us to live. So Tadodaho, he had his own special belt for the position that he holds within the Confederacy, the Great Tree of Peace. So you're looking at wampum mats. Also religious, wampum was used religiously. So in 1799, the prophet Handsome Lake, Seneca Sachem, has visions, and he relays this message to his people. And at the time, just around 10 years earlier, General Sullivan was sent through Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca country to burn and destroy every village that they come upon. So this was a tactic by George Washington at the time to draw out the Haudenosaunee warriors that were attacking settlements along the north, in the northeast and along the New England coast. So around this time period, our people were suffering land loss heavily at the hands of the speculators and the businessmen at the time. And a lot of our communities, traditional communities, were being sold off. This had a detrimental effect to the people's morale, and they turned to all these different things to try and ease the pain of the atrocities that they had witnessed of the Sullivan's campaign. The older warriors who had experience in the American Revolution, who fought either with the British or the Americans. So Handsome Lake comes to the people and he says, I've received the message, and if we follow this message, we'll survive, we'll adapt. So heavenly beings visited him in these dreams and in these states of trance, and they relayed this message from our great Creator. And they also used wampum to do that with. So Handsome Lake, as he stood and delivered this message to the Seneca people, he held strings of wampum. And that was to have, it almost works like a lightning rod. So, or like Hiawatha's mind, right? He's trying to put these thoughts out there, these good thoughts. So he's using wampum, and it's also a testament to his message that it's the truth. So even the first president of the United States, George Washington, recognizes the use of wampum amongst the Haudenosaunee peoples. So in 1794, the United States, they signed the peace treaty with the Iroquois chiefs and the Five Nations, or the Six Nations. Tuscarora became the Six Nations around 1722. So in 1794, he sent Timothy Pickering to have a peace treaty with the Iroquois peoples, and he also commissioned this belt to be made by two Oneida women, and he wove this belt with the symbols, with the white and the purple beads. So we have this belt to remember that time. It's a history. So the history between the United States and the Iroquois Confederacy goes back to its roots before the before the United States was formed. So George Washington, he sends this belt with Timothy Pickering, and this belt also, in our minds, from our perspective, ratifies that treaty because of an exchange of wampum has taken place. So the covenant chain of friendship, it existed between the first five nations, right? So they all decided that they would all live under this perpetual tree of peace. And all the chiefs, that they formed this chain of the 50 that we saw in the circle. So when the Dutch came, they wanted to make friends with the Iroquois people, but they were, a lot of them were motivated by monetary means of, fur trading. So then they made this agreement of friendship, and then it was grandfathered by the French, and then later on by the English, and then by George Washington. So George Washington says, I will adopt this agreement, but instead of having an iron chain of friendship, we'll have a silver chain of friendship. So wampum also has this metaphor for a silver chain of friendship between the United States and the Haudenosaunee people. So I think the exhibit in the NMAI on the National Mall, there is a treaties exhibit, and one of the first treaty that you see when you first walk in to the exhibit is the Timothy Pickering Treaty of 1794, the grandfather of all treaties. So because it was one of the very first treaties that was made between an Indian nation and the new United States. So we have this wampum belt to commemorate that history. But to us, it's not a relic. To us, it's a symbol of an agreement between two sovereign states, the United States and the Haudenosaunee. So replicas, wampum, we can use replicas, replica beads. So when we talk about one of the questions of the orator's dilemma is, if he's using replica beads, does that mean he's still telling the truth, or is he not telling the truth? Because one of the things that happens is that the European groups around the 1600s, they kind of take this idea of wampum and the value that it has, and then they send beads back to Europe to be manufactured as glass wampum. So then glass wampum floods into the Northeast in North America, and then the production of real wampum is actually it actually ceases to exist at a certain point in time, because now we can conveniently have glass wampum. So again, the orator's dilemma is wampum still, is the message still conveyed and truthfully conveyed with the use of replica wampum? So in our eyes, we say yes, it can, because the symbols that the original wampums, we've replicated the symbols, but the symbols still have that same power. So when we talk about the physicalness of wampum, it has this very strong texture to it. It can survive for many, many, many generations because of the physicalness of it. It's just this group of calcium molecules that just, they live through time. So to me, that was another reason why our ancestors used wampum, was because it lasted, it was strong. And then they conveyed words into it so that the words would last just as long as the wampum has. So again, wampum has another use, which was monetary. So the shells that were collected not far from here, in the early days of wampum being made in factories, the shells actually grew as big is probably like almost a foot in diameter, the original shells. But then because wampum was so high in demand that they start harvesting the shells a lot earlier. And then now, today, because of that, the effects of that, the shells only grow probably like around 5 to 6 inches in diameter. So, at the Rochester Museum and Science Center, within our own communities, we've often asked this very question to our own people. The question that's asked is, how can we take these original principles that the wampum has and put them into use? And the dilemma that we have is that even our own people today, they have a hard time grasping these ideas. And part of the reason that we see is because wampum isn't really produced like it was, and it's not really used as much as we've used it in the past. So a wampum maker, when they first start making wampum out of this shell, they gained all this experience making it, and they used it for all these different purposes. So then that man hands on the knowledge that he has to his son or his nephew, and then he adds more experience to that, manufacturing wampum with just 2 hands and primitive tools. So he gains more experience, and then he hands that down to his son and then his nephew. So a 10-year-old boy or a 13-year-old teenager does not have the skills right off the bat to just come out and start producing wampum. So he has to learn that from his uncle. But at the same time, he's learning more than just learning how to make physical wampum. He's learning the ideas about peace, power, righteousness. He's also gaining respect for his uncle. He's gaining this higher level of learning and education, from his father or from his uncle. But then the other dilemma that our people have suffered, the orator's dilemma, is that when glass wampum comes, all of that ceases also. The idea of interacting between 2 human beings, the gain of respect, love, and compassion that you have for this individual who taught you all these years of how to make wampum. With the coming of the glass wampum, that cuts all that out. And that's the dilemma that our people have, because it happens all across our culture. The same thing happens with clay pots. Women who gain all this experience, and because they learn from their grandmother, and then they hand that down. So they hand down the stories, they hand down the knowledge of the woods, the knowledge of mixing clay, and the ratios, the science. All that gets cut out because you have the introduction of the brass pot, and then so on and so on and so on. So that's the orator's dilemma that we have, even amongst our own people, is how to replace those values, and what can we put back into our community to try and bring those back. So that was also the orator's dilemma, the dilemma that I had when the Rochester Museum was repatriating objects back to our own community, was because they only looked at it as a brass pot. They only looked at it as just a bead. They only looked at it as a manufactured item. They only looked at it, as a glass bead, even though it was a real wampum. But they looked at it in that sense. So we've had to convey these ideas to the, to the museum. Was that, well, these are living objects. They tell our history. They tell our stories. So even we look at them as family members, grandfathers. So when you put harmful chemicals on them, it's almost like putting harmful chemicals on your own grandfather. Would you do that to your own grandfather? Would you stick your own grandfather in the freezer? No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't do that. So we've kind of been dealing with this dilemma and trying to answer these questions ever since 1989, when the museum had to answer for the many years of different techniques of conservation, arsenic and mercury, because the same dilemma happened with the returning of sacred objects that people had to use again after they've been treated with conservation methods of arsenic and mercury. So sacred faces, wooden faces, they were treated with arsenic and mercury. So the museum had to answer to that, because now you're going to return these objects to the people and they're going to reuse them. So we've tried to convey to the museum that, well, maybe you have a responsibility to clean them, but clean them with these methods and treat them as if they were living beings. So don't just sand off the surface of the sacred face because you're sanding off the arsenic or mercury. You wouldn't do that to your grandfather if his face was dirty. You would gently find ways to clean his face with the utmost respect and care. So that's the orator's dilemma. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation, what I had to say. I know I went a little bit over time. I'm sorry. I apologize. And I hope to answer more of your questions as we get into the actual panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie. Rose Evans will be our next speaker.
E toi whakairohi mana tangata, tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa. Ko witako nā tata tio tuku tupuna, ko tiatiawa tuku iwi, ko Rose Evans tuku ingo. Nā mihi nui ki a koutou, he mihi ana, tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you to the Bard for bringing me here. It's for this really interesting conversation that we're going to have. I don't know where it's going to go, but it's going to be interesting. I found it a daunting task actually initially because I thought, what are Indigenous ontologies, etc. So I thought I would really approach it from a mātauranga Māori or Māori knowledge perspective, and so that's how I'm not going to give an academic précis, so to speak. First of all, I gave a small mihi then. It's a customary practice that we have back home. And what that does is it sets out who I am, sets out my descent line, because really I'm trying to lay out the connections that I may have with anyone in this room. And essentially I'm telling you what my whakapapa is, and whakapapa is a descent. And it is one of the most essential matters in Māoridom. Māori have multiple identities. We're tribal, urban, we're rural, generational differences, gender differences, and we all have different ethnicity mixes as well, as you can see from me. But we all link together with our whakapapa. That is why I greeted you in that way, because it's so important. It provides our worldview, and in this, for instance, I thought to myself, how will I convey what whakapapa is So I've conveyed that with my own whakapapa here, with the images of my family going back 150 years. My mother, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my great-great-great-grandmother there. And it conveys my whakapapa through from my tiatiawa side. It also connects me and us as Māori to our natural world. It's sort of, you can see that through our, it's all sort of articulated through the, the creation story, where we move from darkness to kore to the world of light, te o marama. And that is done by Sky Father Rangi being separated from the Earth Mother Papa by their child Tāne. And many children then become, I suppose a way to translate it would be gods of those natural elements. And so really, whakapapa explains that sort of vast cosmic family that we're all part of. We're a family of birds and fish and humans and weather. And within a sort of layered world of humans, gods and ancestors. So it's an integral notion of how we see the world. But within in this world, there is tapu and noa. And tapu is the realm of the dead that requires respect. And then there's noa, which is the everyday and living. These are, and a way to negotiate tapu and noa is through tikanga. And tikanga is, I suppose it would be translated as a ritual, and it's a way to find an appropriate way to behave in a particular situation. So tikanga doesn't really alter. It does alter a little through tribal origins and also dependent upon what the situation is. So Aaron asked me to sort of cover a few sort of basic facts about our belief system, so I just went through that to you. But to introduce my talk today, I'd like to say a whakataukia, which is a proverb, titiro whakamuri hōkiri whakamua, which is to look back, reflect, and so you can move forward. And I think why I'm bringing that up as a whakataukia is that it represents for me regeneration, growth, and change in our culture. It's been very hard for me for the last 28 years, and I've worked in museums, and museums have always valued authenticity and orthodoxy. They really haven't valued disruption and change. And it's very concerning for me. I prefer to talk not about tradition but in customary practice. You see, the term customary practice enables the incorporation of disruption and growth, but also repeating and retaining practice. So essentially, that whakatauki says to me that my culture changes, recovers, adapts, and evolves. And it's been over the last, from the 19th and 20th century, it's been a very difficult period for Māori because they've had to evolve through land loss and loss of life and through loss of customary practice. So it's actually, how do I say it? It describes who we are as a culture. We're not a static culture. We're one that continually moves and changes. I wanted to discuss toimoko, they're the preserved tattooed heads, as a way of responding to the bard's question. And about Indigenous Ontologies, I thought that it would be a more practical perspective. for the last 28 years, I've worked on a continued basis with Toimoko. There are very few of us who have done that. I should actually change the next slide. I wasn't intending to work with Toimoko at all. In fact, I wasn't even aware that they were being repatriated at the time. I went back to work at the National Museum, and my whanaunga, who's my relative, Maui Pomare, had essentially, under the covers, started the repatriation movement. He, in fact, recalled, 37 preserved heads from overseas internationally. So, and he'd also set up a vault in the museum that no one really knew about. But as I had said in my abstract, he was rangatira, or of chiefly rank. But he was astute, educated, and he worked in Māori and Pākehā worlds. This is him here. But he's largely unknown, actually, because other people have come into the fore as being involved with Toimoko and in repatriation, but he, in fact, started this. And he spent most of his life trying to repatriate tupuna, who are our ancestors. He one day came up to me after 6 months of being back and said, "I think it's time that you started working with your ancestors, Rose, your tupuna. So come with me." I had no idea what he was going to do, but he mentored me, talked with me, but most of all, he gave me the cultural protection to be able to work with Toimoko. They are what we call tapu tapu. They are our ancestors. They're not representatives of, they're not representing in any way. They actually are our ancestors. We don't know where the majority of them are from, where their papakainga or their homeland is. We're trying to find that out through waiata, or song, and oral histories, and archival records, and tāmoko patterns, but it's very difficult to know because, I think that practitioners might have moved around the country, and there were, it's very difficult to find out. So if you don't know who your ancestor is and who is in that room, you won't be taking them back to your papakainga. So essentially they go to Te Papa now, which in 2003 the governments essentially allowed Te Papa to become the repository of repatriated Toimoko. But I have to say that they're very potent and very powerful. And I would never have undertaken this work if it hadn't been for Maui providing that cultural protection, but also if I hadn't had whakapapa connecting me to them. I would never go near them. At least I'm related to them, and I can give them respect from my own culture. But the most interesting thing about Maui is that he emphasised the need to gather information, not just from academic resources, but I don't really think that he put them aside. He said, actually, it's from observation, Rose. It's from looking and understanding the trends and the continued practice. It's also from looking at other taonga Māori. And that really has set me on the path of how I work as a conservator and also as a conservator of Māori descent. It's sometimes a very difficult situation to be in. He believed that, I'll put it on to the next one. He believed that they were the link to our past, to our deep past, to the old world, potentially giving us information that we have lost. We've lost this customary knowledge in the 19th century. These are drawings by Horatio Robley. Robley was a professional soldier. He came to New Zealand in 1863, only for 2 years, and he became, I would have to say, correctly, obsessed by tuimoko and the tāmoko patterns. He saw tuimoko as, or the tāmoko, the tattooing patterns, as the highest form of art. So that's the reason why when he got back to England, he collected internationally tuimoko. I didn't want to put any images up on the screen because I feel that was culturally insensitive, but I did put these drawings up so it would give you an idea about what I was talking about. But you'll see that these ones actually, what am I talking about? He collected quite a number, and they went to the American Museum of Natural History, who then have recently been repatriated. So I've in fact been at the other end and worked on them and observed them at Te Papa where I work. They used to be called mukamukai, which is a tattooed slave or pet, but the word now to describe them, to give them more respect, is toimoko, which is an art form, tattooed art form. They were initially preserved as an act of veneration and respect, but as well as that, conversely, they could have been preserved if they were not related to you as a form of insult and abuse. But later they could be used intertribally as a way of providing peace and alliance. So they were, an active part of our community or our society. However, European interest was very strong in their collections, and so they were heavily traded for muskets. And this led to this shocking cycle of the musket wars, where more and more, utu was performed, or revenge was performed on your various enemy tribes. But at the same time as that, you could collect more and more and more tattooed heads. And this increased intertribal warfare, then causing mass migration through New Zealand, then loss of land, loss of life, and loss of customary practice and knowledge. So this was very much part of the loss of a lot of our customary practice was the collections of these tuimoko. The appetite for these was huge, and for private collectors, but also large museums. But my work has gone into observing. It's not a typical conservation practice, but more an observation and research to determine the signatures, so to speak, or the trends in the preservation techniques. So I look at the preparation techniques, the fabrication of the materials used in that preparation, the materials used in that preparation and their application, and the level of skills and the connections with other customary practice such as raranga or weaving, and whakairo, which is carving, and really putting toimoko at the centre stage of customary practice instead of at the side as they once were. And there has been, very recently, a sort of sea change from a Māori perspective of what these, or how to respect these toimoko. In the past, you see, they'd been associated with grief and loss, and the past, and it's very interesting when Rob Lee approached James Carroll, who was minister at the time, who was Māori. Can I, if you give me the basic fee, can I give you these back? And James Carroll said, no, they need to stay away, because we're moving forward, and as Māori, we're moving into the future. And that is essentially how they've been treated since then. But Maui's perspective was, hang on, if they come back, let's study them, let's look at them, let's see what they connect us to and what information they can give, because we've lost too much to actually say we don't want to deal with them anymore. We're too fearful of where that might take us. So I have taken on this task, and for many years it is have kept it very quiet, because it hasn't been. I think that people have had that attitude and they've thought, why are you dealing with them? Why are you touching them? Why would you be with them? But I feel I have a responsibility to Maui, and to a responsibility because he allowed me and gave me the safety to be able to work with them. And so I look at various aspects about them, and I don't know how to use this. It's something, I press something, don't know what. Oh, here we go. I look at, for instance, the collars. Is anyone in this room aware of any toi muka? Have anyone seen any at all? They have absolutely extraordinary preparation techniques, and they're very skillful. And they have collars, different types of collars made from different plant materials, multi-ply, 3-ply, 2-ply. They're stitched beautifully, a high level of skills in many cases around the neck form. Their mouths are often sutured shut. The suturing itself and the material it's used provide me with signatures as to how and who did these. Sometimes the mouths are held open in a perfect circle because they've been anchored into the jawline. And the most, the most intricate manner, using weaving techniques that are very similar to cloaks. And the noses often have a type of bridge that keeps their shape, and they'll have different types of plugs, maybe power shell, maybe plant fibre, but often muka, which is a flax fibre that's been prepared. And the preparation technique changes with the different types of plugs. So I can start to work out who might have done this. Their eyes have been sutured shut in the same way, and sometimes open. They've been held open or sutured open. And for me, what that's saying is that because I've worked for so many years, and such an old woman now, that I am starting to realise that the skill level was extremely high, and in most cases, but in some cases, because they were the later stages of trade, they were made for trade, they may have had tāmoko that was applied posthumously, and they were done quickly, basically on the hoof. So I'm now in the midst of gaining together all my information and putting those trends together to try and see if we can find some more information about where they've come from, who may have made them. I don't really need any material science to tell me that, because I can actually work it out from the way that they're made. They have weavers' signatures and carvers' signatures. So here's another taonga Māori, like this is a taiaha, which is I suppose a spear, so to speak, and the awe, which is around, like collar around their necks. I've taken a deep interest in taiaha for some reason. It seems interesting, but nevertheless, their layering and the application of materials is so similar to toi muku. It's unbelievable. And the materials that are used, often small pieces of red military wool, red being very tapu, and also colour for peace alliance, has often been slipped inside in secretive places, sometimes tapa, sometimes woven cotton fabric from the early settlers' dresses, and with traditional methods of kuri or dog fur, dog hair, tassels and muka and raupo around the neck. So what I was seeing when I was looking at taiaha was very similar to toi muku, because it was about layering and adding potency, and because this is a weapon after all, and it needs to be powerful. Then I start to look at cloaks, you know. This is very interesting, Kuruwai, and this is a transitional one really. You can see all the wools being used, etc. But what is a really strong interest to me is the stitching, and the stitching over the top, which isn't really very traditional at all. However, or it's not been considered to be traditional. However, when I'm starting to look at the toi muku, I think stitching was quite typical. In the old day, 10 years ago, everyone assumed that stitching was introduced to Māori society through the missionaries, because teaching women how to, the gentle woman's ways with samplers, etc. And so naturally they would start transferring that into cloaks. But what I'm seeing is that actually stitching was already quite prevalent. And so we start to see things a little differently now. And it's really interesting. I think the weavers who are a little frightened to go near the toi muku, and that's fair enough, but they are starting to say, yes, okay, there are some connections, and perhaps they are more, toi muku are more part of our customary practice than we had initially assumed. And then we have carving, of course. This is a Madonna and Child. It's clearly a transition carving, but done in a very sort of quite a traditional way. But what I'm bringing up there is the carving and the tā muku are very closely related, because tā muku in New Zealand, which is quite unusual in the Pacific, is actually chiselled into your face, and not in the Pacific though, where it's dotted into, and the paint and the pigment is placed into it at the same time. In tā muku, which is what you saw on the toi muku, the skin is chiselled away, and then the ink is applied with muka or a fibre as such. So there are all of these connections. It's very exciting, and we're at this period now where we're starting to make some inroads into connecting up and to other taonga Māori. But it also, what it does is that from a Māori perspective, it opens a world of knowledge, and it opens, connections that were certainly unknown before, and from Māori there is a sea change happening. And tā muku artists are more interested in working now to look at the tā muku patterns. Weavers are now some are starting to look at some of the weaving, and carvers are also starting to see the relationships as well. So I suppose what I'm trying to get at in this talk is to say that conservation this type of conservation is in a sense a way of opening up a whole lot of other areas of knowledge that we have, and opening up a lot of questions and changing attitudes and perspectives from one of grief and loss to one of a revitalisation of our customary practice. So, nō reira, tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou, and thank you.
Thank you, Rose. And our final speaker will be Sanchita, and then we will all join each other up here at the table.
Hello. I want to start by thanking Aaron Glass and the Bard Graduate Center for inviting me to participate in this already fascinating series of conversations. I also wanted to especially acknowledge the United States India Educational Foundation, under whose auspices I had at Fulbright to do 8 months of archival research at the Government Museum in Chennai and the Tamil Nadu State Archives, also in Chennai. And really, it was through the opportunity to spend so much time with the words, the archives of this colonial museum, that really brought me the opportunity to think a little bit more about how the Colonial Museum functioned. And it was also through this time spent in the archives that I actually miraculously found my grandfather in the archives entirely, to my entire family's surprise. Because as it turns out, in the 1930s and 40s, he was actually studying the very same ancient Indian bronzes that I'd gone to research. So I'm grateful to everybody for giving me the opportunity to meet my own relative in the archives. In October 1927, appearing out of the earth in Kandarikote village was the god Shiva himself, a bronze image of the god Shiva. A printed tract circulated by Hindu devotees of the village and preserved in the archives of the Government Museum Chennai described the event as, quote, an extraordinary miracle, and stated that Shiva himself was appearing, quote, in several places to prove what is said in the sacred epic of the Bhagavad Gita. Shiva himself said, I will appear when justice is put down by injustice to reestablish fairness. The larger sense of injustice as recorded in this tract is the fact that Indians, and particularly Hindus, were losing their religion because of the corrosive influence of Western civilization. But the more immediate injustice that this particular tract responds to was the impending acquisition of the bronze image of Shiva by the then Madras Government Museum. The 1927 tract ends with a devotional song titled Plea to the Devotees, asking that that devotees of the village gather funds to build a new temple in which the image could be reconsecrated and then worshipped. Despite collecting 1,250 rupees, quite a large sum, for the construction of a new temple, and appealing to the government, and this is a quote from the letter written on the behalf of these villagers, the memorialists beg for a very sympathetic consideration over their prayer and ask that they be allowed to worship all the consecrated idols. So despite this plea, the Madras government, as per the rules of the 1878 Indian Treasure Trove Act, decided to grant the museum the images instead. This story takes place in colonial India in the southern Indian administrative region known as the Madras Presidency, and my focus here is to look at a series of exchanges, perhaps unequal and political exchanges, but also petitions, letters, and other evidence of interaction between religious devotees, museum administrators and conservators, and the museum-going audience of the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the administrative capital of Madras. I will look specifically at the work of the Madras Government Museum, now called the Government Museum Chennai, a collecting institution at the center of the city, as you can maybe see from this red box here, which by the late 1800s was already described as the, quote, showplace of Madras. It was a place of important scholarly and popular reach, and this colonial museum displayed initially objects that were explicitly products of the presidency, natural history specimens, botanical and textile products, and in its early years, even a living zoological garden complete with a python that ate rats and molted skin to the delight of its visitors. Archaeology as a collecting area is not even listed as a subject until the early 1900s, even though archaeological objects, things emerging from the ground, primarily in the form of Hindu bronze sculptures, began to infiltrate the museum soon after the passage of the previously mentioned Indian Treasure Trove Act of 1878. The Treasure Trove Act sought to protect and preserve objects of archaeological and historical value literally emerging from the ground on either public or private land during the process of building railways, roads, expanded agriculture, and even everyday maintenance of people's properties. Treasure included, quote, objects of antiquarian interest discovered below the surface of the soil, but applied primarily to, quote, isolated remains, such as a capital which is found lying without a shaft, or stray statues, the original site of which is unknown, and these were expected to be removed to some museum in order to save them from future injury. Now, this legislation was a means of limiting, one, the damage and reuse of metal or stone sculptures, especially by local populations. It was also meant to staunch the flow of antiquities into foreign markets, which was happening more and more. But it was really also part of a much larger colonial project of creating and displaying a history of India through archaeological evidence, which was thought to be the purest form of evidence one could have. But the Treasure Trove Act was an evolving document and was sometimes quite contradictory and difficult to apply. Only a few years after the initial act was written, the government recommended minimizing the removal of any objects that could wound local sentiments, claiming that things related to, quote, religious cults should not be collected. In 1910, 30 years later, the government then insisted that it was, quote, undesirable that figures or objects of archaeological interest should either be lent or given away for devotional purposes. So this really contradictory way of administering this act often leaves local administrators, museum officials, but ultimately the officers of the government of Madras responsible for negotiating where objects that were both archaeological and devotional in nature should go. So the process for actually processing treasure trove finds was that finds were first documented in either drawings, such as these early ones, or later through photographs. And the Government Museum has a really amazing collection of these early images. After this, the finds had to actually be published, and within 6 months of these publications, both in English and the local vernacular languages, anyone who claimed these objects needed to appear to request possession. When objects were acquired by the museum, a fee based on the current material value of the weight of the objects was paid to the finders, and that's what you see here, the thumbprints showing the acceptance of payment by these finders. So once the objects actually reach the museum, though, the procedure becomes in some ways much less certain, especially at a time when very few Hindu bronzes, or really Hindu objects of any kind, were part of the museum's collecting interest. In 1912, it was reported that the entire landing at the top of the staircase of the new building, and that's what I'm showing you here, had been set aside for larger figures, and all of them had been labeled. And this is sort of my imagination of what that might have looked like. The 3 images of the god Shiva as Nataraja were reported as, quote, providing a source of attraction for caste visitors and arranged along the top staircase. So you can see this wasn't a particularly interesting collecting area, and it wasn't very clear where to actually place these objects within the scope of the museum. Now, there are nearly 50 treasure trove cases between the late 1800s and 1947, the year of Indian independence, that are preserved in the archives at the museum as well as the Tamil Nadu State Archives. And I think what they really show us is that the museum becomes a space of exchange and negotiation as to what archaeological devotional, so I'm going to call them archaeo-devotional objects, needed and wanted. I want to complicate the idea of the colonial museum as a monolith that defines the colonial encounter and puts forth a certain agenda. Instead, from looking at the archives, what emerges is a much more porous type of institution that had to respond to the demands of its religious publics and was defined in part by its interactions with them. But the museum also exerted an influence on religious devotees and more general museum visitors through its care of these archaeo-devotional collections. So for this talk, I will focus primarily on Hindu bronzes, though there are Buddhist and Jain objects also debated in the archives. And I will look at 3 particular points. One, I will discuss objects that are not acquired by the museum and that are activated through religious use. Second, I will look at objects that are acquired by the museum, but then deactivated in some way through chemical conservation. And then I will look at this 3rd category of things that are both acquired and not acquired and reactivated through new means of display. So many of the treasure trove cases relate to Hindu bronzes, as I've mentioned, and these utsavamurtis, or bronze images that are meant to be carried in procession outside and around temple precincts on festival days, are images that are temporarily embodied by the actual presence of the divine. And as processional objects, they're meant to be, therefore, movable, unlike the stone image that is typically the central deity of the temple. This portability also made these images more likely to be moved, deconsecrated, buried, or otherwise displaced during times of upheaval, and the majority of the petitions and letters request the return of these movable objects. Now, most of the petitions are written from the 1920s onwards. Most are written in English, and the majority are actually written by members of the religious boards responsible for different local temples, and typically actually don't address the museum, but rather address authorities above the museum, such as the Board of Revenue or even the governor of Madras, the most important political player of all. And I will really only concentrate on 2 arguments that are made, though there are many more. The first argument is that these objects, well, they're not objects, they're deities, are communal property, and they're meant to bring health to the community through community's care. In 1938, a petition from the villagers of Kaveripakam mentioned that we are really proud, and this is a quote, we are really proud to say that we lead a respectable life on account of the sculptures which were adorned by our forefathers. It is our humble belief that we are leading a happy life on this account, and through this we are having our faith in God and His grace. So deities provide a very protective care to the communities while they're being venerated in them, being able to even have these physical effects, such as in one case, thwarting the outbreak of contagious diseases like cholera. There could be dire physical consequences if a lack of care was actually a concern. In the same place, Kaveripakam, when the local administrator was trying to investigate claims about some of the objects found there, he found, quote, one Ravanappa Reddy, an old man, was said to have a dream that there was no puja or worship done to the goddess, and that if they did not do it, evil would befall the village. I went to his house but could not talk to him as he was lying in bed with typhus fever. But the return of an image also offered the opportunity of a change in circumstances. The villagers of Annamelagaram claimed that as a result of the loss of their deities and their temple, the village had, quote, become a desert, and woe and misfortune are written on the faces of the people, unquote. However, if the bronzes were returned to that village, as they had been in the nearby village of Mulliam, there was a possibility that perhaps things would change. Quote, as soon as the idol was reinstalled in a temple in Mulliam, the next town, that part of the village became prosperous. So, if the government help us to have a temple in our village also, prosperity will soon flourish, and what appears to be a desert now will once again become a good village. A second argument that's put forward, and these images are slightly later, but I didn't have any images from the villages I'll be mentioning, and they're all wonderful. The second argument that's put forward is that the original religious and artistic intention of the objects has to be respected, and this is something we evoke a lot in conservation, the idea of the original intention. In 1942, the lawyer for A.D. Periyatambi of Kalanipakam village argued that my client begs to submit for your earnest and favorable consideration that the idols be returned to him so that he may carry out their divine wish of installing them in a religiously consecrated temple. So these were divine wishes that needed to be followed. The trustee of a nearby temple, who actually wanted the same images for his institution, his temple, pointed out to the Board of Revenue that, quote, from the exquisite workmanship, it should be clear to anybody that such idols would have been made for some good and big temple like mine. If considering the laudable object of the maker of these idols, so the maker is important here, and the purpose for which they're intended, if these are returned to me, they can once again be installed in the Devasthanam, in the place of the gods, and worshipped as intended by the person who has very devoutly made them. So not only do the gods wish this, but also the people who made the images of the gods wish for these images to be consecrated and worshipped here. Another point made by the executive officer of the Devasthanam of Manargudi writes in 1942 that the Board of Revenue should return an image of Sri Andal because, quote, an idol is primarily intended for worship, and only when that object is not likely to be achieved can the study of scholars be substituted. The revival of worship of Sri Andal in an established place of great importance is positively more important than any opportunity given to scholars who may or may not be forthcoming to avail themselves of it. The many arguments put forward by religious devotees were often successful, with objects being returned on the behalf of government to villagers as, quote, an act of grace, and often overruling the museum's desires for acquisition. A chagrined letter from the museum superintendent, Frederick Gravely, shows that of the 44 objects requested for acquisition between 1921 and 1935, only one was acquired by the museum. As a result, it seemed there needed to be a different kind of strategy by which objects could be acquired for the museum. And this, in fact, became the idea behind the notion that objects that can no longer be venerated and therefore are already deactivated and cannot be activated should reasonably come to find a home in the museum. Such was the case of a Nataraja found in Mela Perambalam in 1936. As gravely, the superintendent wrote to the government, the Nataraja is badly damaged, one leg being almost severed and one flame of the Prabha, which is this one here, is missing, is broken. It is therefore ceremonially unfit for worship, nor will it be rendered ceremonially fit by mending, as this is not permitted by the holy books. The Devi image, the consort, is a beautiful image, and as the two belong together, a single set of both should be acquired. Now, there are multiple negotiations that go on with this particular image, and in the end, it was actually acquired by the museum, and the very kind of basic label belies the complicated acquisition story behind this particular image. And if you look closely at the image now, you can see clearly the gash that made this object ceremonially unfit, that allowed it to be actually preserved in the museum collection. Already by the 19-teens, the bronze collection had grown significantly from the 3 images originally exhibited on the landing to almost 300 objects. And despite early attempts at preventive conservation, what we might call preventive conservation, such as creating quite an elaborate set of display cases. These are all display cases that are made of teak wood with glass fronts to protect these objects from the marine air of Madras. We find references to these objects decaying and showing evidence of damage. By 1925, we have a report that 297 bronzes were suffering from contagious disease, which goes on spreading by degrees, destroying all the surface, and that some of these bronzes were badly affected with creeping or malignant patina. And this is clearly bronze disease or some other kind of active corrosion product, but suddenly these objects are becoming reactivated in ways that were not expected. In 1923, attempts to actually mitigate these surface changes and really structural changes began by actually attempting to hire people who might be able to actually intervene on these surfaces. And the Madras government, trying to be very careful with their money, decided that the cheapest and most efficient way to do this would be to hire traditional bronze craftsmen to do this work. And you can see here the Tamil advertisement that was put in the newspapers, as well as an English translation that says in particular that the green patina should be preserved. And one could imagine that if you're known with the skill of actually making new gleaming bronze images, the idea of preserving what is essentially a damaged and therefore ceremonially unfit object would have been very confusing. And in fact, no one was actually chosen for this particular project. The major stride forward in chemical conservation then comes in 1930 with the hiring of S. Paramashivan, a chemist and a physicist, who actually set up the first permanent conservation laboratory for the treatment of museum objects in India. And if you're interested, I've recently published work specifically on Paramashivan's research. Now, he had clearly laid out his treatment priorities as the following. First, to remove disfiguring incrustations which conceal decorative details. Second, to restore the object to its original appearance. And third, to eliminate corrosive substances which were causing disintegration. And he did this by championing the use of the electrolytic reduction technique, a method for treating archaeological bronzes, which was a treatment used already in Europe and the United States, but he really had to customize this treatment for both local conditions and local collections in Madras. And he was working on a scale that's frankly unthinkable abroad. Not only did he work on large numbers of bronzes, but they were literally extremely large, ranging sometimes to several feet in height. And considering this is an electrical technique, he was working with a very unreliable electrical supply. He actually designed and opened a custom-built laboratory for the treatment of bronzes in 1937, a plan of which you see here. And objects, and really this is a monument to the electrolytic treatment method. We're looking in this photograph at this image of the electrolytic cells room, and in this room, objects would be immersed in these large tanks filled with sodium hydroxide. They were then connected to these electrical units, and electrical current would be applied in order to actually reduce the active corrosion to elemental metallic copper. Sometimes this treatment could take days, if not weeks or months, and after this treatment was done, the objects would move from the electrolytic cells room to the washing room. One innovation, really, that Parameshivin came up with was, given how heavy some of these bronzes were when they were placed inside these tanks, the electrolyte would be dispersed from underneath, or displaced from underneath the objects, and so the undersides of these bases would not be properly reduced. So what he came up with was the technique of actually making small holes in the bases of these images. But what's fascinating is he's actually mimicking cast-in holes that were actually made by medieval bronze casters so that these processional bronzes could be used ritually. So he's really kind of thinking of this particular visual idiom, if you will. Once the objects left the electrolytic cells, they would go into the washing room, where Mr. Arokyaswamy would remove the, quote, greenish sludge that had deposited on the objects, and then would coat them until gleaming using different forms of wax. Another very important part of the work of Parameshivin was his interest in really studying, in his analytical laboratory, the different deterioration phenomena, but also the original manufacturing techniques of these objects. And I think this is the space where he spent most of his time with my grandfather, who contributed his knowledge of metallographic cross-sections. Now, Parameshivin was initially asked to only work for a few years, because the idea was that once all of these objects had been stabilized, they would no longer require treatment. But what became clear through these interventions was the recognition that the care of collections was a perpetual and ongoing one and required the work of a specialist. And therefore, instead of this being simply a short-term response, this would be something that was a perpetual kind of deactivation. While I might have thus far seemed to be suggesting that there's some clear binary between a kind of active preservation of objects in their original religious context and a deactivating kind of preservation in the museum context, the archival evidence contradicts this. In fact, it resists this. In fact, what we have is evidence of the porosity of these spaces and their publics, and how this exchange changes both spaces and publics by reactivating archaeo-devotional objects, specifically, I think, through new means of display, and I'll mention just a few. First, we have to confront the idea of the museum as a temple festival and the temple festival as a museum. From museum records, it's clear that the largest number of visitors to the museum came on Hindu festival days, particularly Kanu Pongal, during the harvest festival of Pongal, typically in January. The museum, as a free institution, was a place of very popular resort, and in 1901, when over 180,000 visitors came in a single day, it was reported that the huge crowd was thoroughly well behaved, and no theft, accident, or damage to the collections occurred. So it's a surprisingly well-behaved group of visitors. In the 1935 visit of S.F. Markham and H. Hargraves, who were writing their book Museums of India, they observed on this feast day that the museum was an orderly and happy crowd, where a piece of string stretched across a passage could divert and restrain them. And although the interior of the museum was packed and produced the inevitable accompaniment of fingered glass, beetle nut spit, and dirty marks on the walls, one realized that this was one of the surest ways of interpreting the outside world to the masses of India. Obviously, there's some real problems with the tone here, but it gives you a sense of just how tactile the experience of visiting the museum must have been. Now, the festivals don't just come to the museum goes to the festivals. In 1945, during the once every 12-year Mahamakam festival, the museum was actually invited to loan exhibits and provide demonstrations, quote, on the need for the proper preservation of objects, relics, edifices, and places of archaeological interest. In fact, Parameshivin himself, the conservator, provided a few demonstrations in the methods of the conservation of images and other antiquities. Opportunities for display also expanded beyond the confines of either the museum or the religious context and spill over into places such as the Kodiakare railway station, where bronzes that had been found nearby were put on exhibition during the Thai Amavasi festival, an auspicious day for venerating one's ancestors. If the railway station seems like a strange place for archaeo-devotional bronzes to show up, consider that in the same year of this find, Superintendent Gravely suggested asking booksellers Higginbothams and Company to, quote, set apart a small corner in every one of their railway stalls for museum publications and pictures. A museum poster may also be kept there close by to attract the people. In fact, museum picture postcards were already an important way in which archaeo-devotional objects from the museum circulated. They were certainly on sale before 1936 and are visible in the little boxes that you see here, and were sold in packages of images associated either with the god Vishnu or the god Shiva. So depending on your religious preference and affiliation, you could buy the appropriate package. Superintendent A. Ayyappan wrote in 1948 that these sets of picture postcards serve the purpose of affording to the visitors cheap mementos of visits and greatly help in making the masterpieces of our collection widely known. Priced quite inexpensively at 1 anna each, these images were still likely beyond the scope of most of these visitors, but the revenue from the postcard sales suggests that between 1,200 to 2,000 postcards were sold every year in the 1930s and 40s, and possibly became functional portable devotional images of previously portable devotional images. I began this presentation with the words of the god Shiva as he emerged from the ground in Kannarikote village. The museum, too, begins to consider the way that voices might assist in making museum displays come alive to its visitors. In 1947, Superintendent Ayyappan described how, quote, as an experimental measure, a gramophone record was made in Tamil of the special exhibition on corals. This record was played to small groups of visitors, and their reactions were carefully watched by me and the scientific staff. So impressed was Ayyappan by these gramophone records and the kinds of responses they were eliciting, which I wish we had more documentation of what that was, that he instantly proposed that similar gramophone records in Telugu, Tamil, and Malayalam be specifically made for the archaeological and Hindu sculpture exhibits, and these are the locations of the speakers. This was all the more complicated because they didn't have electricity inside the museum, so the workaround was pretty complicated. The archival evidence from the Madras Government Museum shows that the complicated and complicating nature of archaeo-devotional objects is something that we really have to consider in much more, I think, broad ways. And as this early audio tour scheme suggests, there is the possibility then of spirit voices entering museum spaces and appealing to the assembled, much in the way that the image of Shiva did in Kannarikote. So what then is possible within the museum is the idea of the museum as a space of negotiation, mediation, but also possibly even transformation. Such was the case in 1938, when after winning the appeal for the removal of objects from the village of Kaveripakam against the will of its residents, the archaeological assistant, Mr. Shivaramamurthy, took the cart drivers into the galleries, where they exclaimed that the museum was like heaven, all the gods being there, and that, of course, their sculptures ought to be there, too. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that series of really fascinating papers. We have about 10 minutes now to answer the question, what is active matter? And what relation these papers have to one another. I want to make sure that our audience has time to engage, so I don't want to moderate too heavily here. But I was struck by a number of very provocative and sort of overlapping themes. Themes of genealogy, with which you all opened, situating yourselves, but also thinking about the role of the transmission of knowledge and skill and practice through objects over time, which can be disrupted through practices of collection and various kinds of treatment, but also reactivated. Another theme of objects, none of you used this term, but of objects as medicine. I think you came closest to it, Jamie, in talking about the healing properties of wampum. But it was a theme that came up throughout: healing communities, healing colonial traumas, but also other kinds of traumas, as one of the ways in which we can think of this particular set of materials as being active in an important way. The role of memory over generations, and objects as carriers, vehicles of memory, prompts for memory. And I guess I just want to get you all started, maybe talking to one another as well as to your own papers, to just think about the variable locus of activity in your case studies. Where do we locate the active in the matters that you have discussed? And you've laid out, there's a number of options, from the kind of molecular level, the level of the calcium of the structure of the wampum, the chemical properties of bronze, the physicality of the materials, of the skin of the toimoko, all the way through to objects activated in performance, that's the moment or the space in which they're activated. And if you could just talk a little bit about that, about where the activity is in your particular set of objects, and then I think we'll open it up to the audience.
You first. So the activity in the wampum in Haudenosaunee culture, it doesn't matter what it is, as long as it comes from the environment, it's active. So because it comes from water, water is active. In the creation story of the Haudenosaunee people, a woman fell from the sky, and when she came down, she fell into this world, and the world was a primordial world of water and water beings. So the world was already active. So the beings that were there in this world, the sky woman realized that this world was active and it was alive already. And then she gave birth to two twins, which to us would become later on as the positive and negative forces that we still live in today. So the active is in the water. Like I had said in my presentation, that water, there is no activity on Earth without the use of water, whether it be in our bodies to re-nourish our energy, to re-strengthen our breath. So hence, when the organism gathers this calcium from its environment, it's active. So the person who's actively making a wampum bead, the activity has already started even before he even picked up that shell to create that wampum bead. And then it gets more active as he starts to create the bead, because he's working on with his two hands and his knowledge and his mind, and he's making the matter even more active by doing that. So he stimulates the shell, and then he works it to the point where he finally is left with this bead. Because in order to make one wampum belt, he has to actively create thousands of beads just to make one wampum belt. So I guess to compare it to another area of our culture, sacred faces, the tree is already active. So when they carve the tree, the power is already there. And as soon as they stick their carving implement into the tree, it's become even more active. So the face becomes alive, but the tree is already there, it's already living, and then it's just transferring that active matter into the face, and then the carver puts his interpretation on what he believes the face should be. It's even more active. So I hope that kind of answers a little bit of what you're asking. Thank you very much.
Well, I feel as if, shall I go next? I feel as if I'm going to say the same thing, almost the same thing as you, because all inanimate and animate objects in Māori worldview have mauri, which is a life essence. But of course, when you and that's on the side, because when you start looking at taonga Māori though, in museums, they are less active if they are not connected with their whakapapa. So that's why I talked about whakapapa. So our genealogy, our descent, and our whakapapa to those taonga make them more active, if that's an answer to the question.
I think from the archival evidence, I can't speak to really the sort of religious aspects of these, but from the archival evidence, I think the possibility of things being active, whether you want them to be or not, is always there. One part I couldn't include in my talk is, the argument the government museum makes, saying these objects are ceremonially unfit for worship, so they should be preserved in the museum. There's one temple that actually counters that, saying, well, they may be ceremonially unfit for worship, but we have our own museum within the temple complex, and we'll take care of them there. So there are lots of different ways in which this care could be kind of carried out. But I think it's more for us to kind of broaden our understanding of how activation could happen and different ways in which things could be active.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So when a sculpture, when a sculpture carving an image is damaged, does that make it inactive culturally? I'm just interested in the fact that they could suddenly say, well, they're inactive, so we'll take them into
Well,
the
again,
museum.
I mean, I can't speak on behalf of religious practitioners, but there are, for example, cases where the Sthapatis or the Silpis, the people who made the bronze images, are asked to come back in after the image is deconsecrated to do the repair, and then the image is reconsecrated. There's some types of damage that are much more problematic in terms of allowing things to be ceremonially fit for worship. But again, the archival evidence shows that, people are not necessarily sticking by these scriptural prescriptions, and it's very frustrating to the museum authorities because they're putting these forward as rules, and what happens is the actual practice is much more fluid than that.
Or perhaps the museum was taking advantage of that.
Well, I mean,
Well,
there's concerns.
Perhaps. Okay, we'd like to have some space and time for questions. Yeah.
In the context of the Tanjore idol, what do you mean by deactivating and activating? I'm not quite clear.
So it's a kind of convention I'm using. So rather than saying that there's some sort of hard line that suggests things are either working and on or absolutely off, what I'm trying to suggest are through these different kind of rituals or practices of care, you can have these objects be much more alive or interactive in different spaces. So one of the arguments that's put forth really by the government museum is that if you can't worship these images for all of these different rules, then really the best place to have these objects remain then is within the museum space where they are safe and they can be saved forever in perpetuity, and scholars and people could enjoy them without this religious sort of activity. But what's really fascinating is, from having spent some time at the government museum and read these archives and talked with people who've been at the museum for a long time, there are ways in which people come and they make offerings to objects within the museum space as well. So people are always defying these very kind of strict ideas that we might have about when something is active or not.
All of the ones that you showed are in a museum, not in a religious place. Is it right?
What's that?
All the idols that you showed on the screen, they're all in museums now, aren't they?
Some of them were acquired and some of them were not. So depending on the case, some actually did come to the museum.
They are not in the temple, are they?
So there's Superintendent Ayyappan actually spends quite a bit of time going and checking up on all of the idols that are returned to these villages to make sure that they're still actually being worshipped in the temples. And what he finds is for all of the objects that he could trace, they were all being actively worshipped. So that.
So this question was really provoked by Rose's just now intervention, saying that when the objects are separated from their, I'm not going to try and pronounce it, from their descent or genealogical information, that they become less active. And so the question then really I want to ask all of you is what that might say about the possible role of scholarship, Western type research scholarship? Does that contribute to activating these objects again, or is it a different kind of knowledge that doesn't have the status that can contribute to reactivation?
Who wants to start?
I mean, I think it depends a lot on the collecting institution, frankly. I think about the opening to Kipling's Kim, where the Lama, the important Buddhist monk, finds himself at the Lahore Museum, and he's in search of this special river with the arrow, and he goes into the museum and he sees stored in the museum all of these religious objects and religious evidence that he had never seen before. And there's this really interesting, debate or conversation, exchange really, that he has with the curator, and the curator says, well, this is what I know, and I can read this inscription that tells you where this thing is. And the Lama says, but if you know this, why don't you know where this river is? And it's this really lovely, obviously sort of very colonial scene that talks about the museum as possibly this mediating place where some exchange could happen. But it depends, I think, on the institution being willing to do that.
Well, that's true. Yeah. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I totally agree, and I think that an institution has to be willing to put the resources, throw the resources to bring communities in and engage with their taonga. If they don't do that, if they're continually organising it under their own principles, then that Western style academic approach won't work. So yeah, that's my response to that, and I don't see so much of it even back in New Zealand either. There are less and less. Well, there's for instance the repatriation research that's been undertaken by Māori for Māori, and that's actually spectacular. But I don't see anywhere else in New Zealand doing that. So it's about directing that knowledge. What do you need to find out?
Jamie, do you want to talk a little bit about GRASAC and your participation in GRASAC as a kind of project that's meant to sort of bridge these ways of knowing?
Sure. So GRASAC is an acronym for the Great Lakes Research Alliance for Indigenous Cultures. And I participate in this team who are trying to bring knowledge from institutions back to make it more available to the community. So institutions, especially that are abroad, who hold Haudenosaunee collections, where 99% of the Haudenosaunee people will never go there and actually visit these objects. So GRASAC is trying to put these objects in a place where that they can be active, and even though it's through a computer screen, the Haudenosaunee member can interact with that object, even if it is digitally, to make that object come back to life and bring the story. So one of the ways that GRASAC has teamed up with traditional communities is that what they're asking of the traditional communities is that, yeah, we have a museum record, and we have a physical record, and we have a record that tells us what the object is made out of physically, but what we're asking from the community are the traditional stories of the object, but also the traditional names in your language. And we can provide this also not only to benefit the academics, but also to benefit your people who are also trying to study these objects from your own culture. So as I had said earlier, the dilemma of the orator, especially in our community, is that Seneca language is becoming endangered. So just because I speak Seneca, that doesn't mean that my brother and sister speak Seneca. So this idea of implementing language and traditional stories not only benefits the academics, but it also will benefit the community in which the object was born and come from.
Thanks. Other questions? Glenn?
Yeah, I have a comment that I'm trying to turn into a question in my mind for the panelists. So I'll say the comment. I think I'm almost there. We're talking about a paradigm shift, at least from my point of view, in conservation. I was trained in a very, I guess, traditional now form of conservation that relied on chemistry to deactivate objects, to stabilize objects. And now we're talking about reactivating objects through, at least tonight, the incorporation of indigenous ontologies and multiple understandings of objects, which necessitates collaboration of people from many different understandings and practices. So I guess the question is, how can we help shift the field? And it seems to me that we need to start doing it in the graduate programs, training young conservators, or at least that's one place to start, where I don't think any of us want to lose that physical, understanding through chemistry and material sciences, or the loss of craft and hand skills in conservation. But it seems like we need to add another form of education to conservation training. So I guess it is a statement, but if anyone
Does anybody disagree?
Well, I think, Glenn, one thing that has helped me a lot is recognizing just how prevalent this kind of, if you want to call it collaboration or really interaction. I mean, it's historic. We have evidence of it. We simply haven't told those stories yet. And so I think the more evidence we can actually pull together and actually make available to both ourselves but also to broader community, I think that will break down this kind of expectation of this is what museums do and this is how they function. I think another thing that's really important is to bring up, I think a lot of people feel that interacting with communities will somehow take power and responsibility away from the scientifically trained conservator, and it's always kind of couched in terms of loss, what we would lose. But I think what's more important is recognizing just how much we are losing by not actually recognizing the sort of polysemic ways in which culture behaves. I mean, how can we not want to know this information? So I think rather than constantly thinking about it as a loss of power, is really about kind of re-empowering these objects of cultural heritage to really tell the stories they were meant to tell.
I put Jamie on the spot, and I'm going to put Rose on the spot. Maybe you could talk a little bit about I know the project that's going on at Te Papa now around the feather cloaks, partially as a response to both Peter and Glenn's questions about bringing different ways of knowing together, the multiple kinds of research one can do to understand not only the genealogies, but the locations for where materials came from, and where the kind of scientific analysis and the whakapapa work can come together to reactivate objects. I don't know that that's the best example for that. It was just one that came to mind.
Yeah, well, I probably would I would probably look at that project I did a while back, which was Te Tākinga, which was a carved particle, and instead it's much the same in many respects, where there was a considerable amount of treatment that I undertook, and the institution was very responsible to Papuas by putting resources in place to bring many Māori in as to build their capability. It wasn't actually about coming in and having a little bit of a chat and providing maybe some food and some drinks. It was about, okay, we're going to put in some finances here, we're going to bring you in, you're going to build your capability in the community, you're going to find out what information we've got, and we're going to find out what you've got, and then some of you are going to be employed, because this is also about bringing people into an institution. It's not that scary, bringing in some people from Indigenous cultures. It's a really generous, but it's also a necessary thing to happen. And but in that instance, the treatments that I undertook with that pātaka was always in collaboration with the runanga that was formed. That was an urban group, and then I would constantly go back to the marae and say, these are the options that we've got. If I was to be as a conservator, these are the options we've got. As a person of Māori descent, these are the options I've got. you know, these are the options, what do you think? And they'd say, okay, we respond in this sense. We don't like this, we don't like this, we don't like this, but we like this, and we would negotiate. And my treatments would change. My treatments would change so that I would always have a sense of reversibility, because reversibility is so important to conservators. And so I was able to satisfy my ethics and conservation, but at the same time satisfy the fact that I was of Māori descent, and boy, I would get, you know, there'd be a lot that would happen to me if I didn't do it properly, in all manner of ways. So, so it can be done, but it's about an undertaking by institutions to bring staff on board. If they're not interested, they shouldn't be involved. They have to be interested and willing to listen and be flexible and change their treatment outcomes. So I was criticised at that time. How could you consider doing this? Why would you do a cosmetic mentee? Well, it's because it's across a te puna face. And so that's not allowed culturally. Oh, well, we don't do that in conservation just because it's a cosmetic thing, if it's not needed, right? Well, we do in Māoridom. So it's really a whole different perspective. It's a different paradigm, Glenn. Yeah, it's about getting into that, because the conversations you have and the growth that occurs with people, with institutional members, but also out and tribal members, is extraordinary, and it's the most satisfying thing to be involved in. And every treatment I do now with taonga always involves people from the papakainga. I work in a number of different places as a private practitioner now, and I wouldn't undertake any treatment without going back. But I know where to go to, so that's always helpful. Some of the hardest thing is knowing who to go to. Anyway.
Take two more questions. Jen.
Okay, as possibly the only chemist in the room here, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the discussion that we've had around chemistry, and I think the best way to think about it is when I first started working on Tibetan objects, I remember I was taught to approach the object with purity of intention. And Jamie, you talked about using arsenic and mercury-based pesticides on objects, and these are challenging materials to defend, and yet they were added to these objects in order to keep them from being consumed by museum pests.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if, from a 19th century perspective and early 20th century perspective, we can think that there was any purity of intention in terms of what was done then, and also what purity of intention would look like going forward for museum care of these objects now.
Yes, well, I think back at the time, I don't think the knowledge of the effects of mercury and arsenic are the same that we have today. So from a community perspective, we don't think that they did it with negative intentions. We do believe that the early conservation methods were done with the best interest of the object, because before I started working at the museum, I had the same attitude towards museums that our whole community had, which was they were thieves, they were mad scientists, and they were stingy of our own cultural objects. But when I started to work with the museum and I started to visibly see these objects and to be able to touch them, that wasn't possible without conservation methods. Yes, some volatile chemicals were used, but at the same time, that object was still around for me to see in the 21st century, and to see the maker's marks, to see that object still living, even though it was conserved with volatile chemicals, and I couldn't touch it and I couldn't handle it. And again, I think it depends on just the community's perspective as well, because even some members in the community, they had the attitude was, well, even though it has arsenic and mercury, we still want it back because the object belongs to us and it wasn't created to hurt us. And if we get poison, then that's just the way it is. But we had other community members who had the opposite perspective. And they said, well, these objects have been contaminated, so now they're deactivated, so now we're going to bury them into the ground. And we no longer use them because they'll bring harm to the community. So even within our own community, we had two different perspectives.
Time for one more question. Is it at the back?
Yeah, I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about the importance of materials specifically within a context of colonialism, because it seems to me like, you know, in a context when people have been displaced or dispossessed of their land, you know, being able to retain materiality or tactility, something that can be held on to as part of a cultural tradition, would be exceptionally important under those conditions. And, you know, you've talked, you know, thank you so much to the speakers for talking about, you know, the indigenous traditions sort of in a pre-contact condition, you know, and illuminating that for us. But I'm curious if you could talk about how possibly the specific conditions of coloniality change the way that people relate to those narratives of the previous utilization. Is that too nebulous?
Well, I mean, I can say it's certainly from the petitions that I've looked at, a lot of the reasons why objects are allowed to be acquired by the museum is because, according to the Treasure Trove Act, you needed to be able to prove ownership in order to reclaim the objects. And this is very difficult for objects or you know, images of divinities that are community owned and are part of a temple rather than owned by an individual. And when people actually do come up with, you know, ways of connecting to former ownership. So this used to be my great-great-grandfather's land, or my uncle 2 generations removed used to live here, and since we found this idol here, this belongs to us. Those are dismissed completely by different colonial administrators. So the burden of being able to prove sort of the kind of ownership that we expect within the Western context is always what gets in the way of people actually reclaiming their objects. So I think certainly within the colonial context in India, this has very serious consequences for where objects finally end up and how they sort of come to live.
Your question was too nebulous. I'm just kidding. At least I don't feel bad. I'm not the only one.
I think actually you all, in your own ways, spoke to that question, both by talking about the detrimental effects of the colonial conditions of collection and, you know, appropriation of the material, but also the capacity of the objects, the various beings to survive that process and to be available for reactivation, partially because they were collected in some cases, but only because enough knowledge survived in community contexts to do that work of reactivation. I think that was a really strong through line. You know, I think I heard in all of your papers both a sense of nuance but also ambivalence about the colonial conditions under which objects are collected, stored, sometimes returned, the variability of access, and you know, the conditions under which they can be reconnected to community and reactivated through knowledge, through genealogy, through practice. I don't want to answer the question for you. I think those perspectives were sort of latent there. Well, on that note of reactivation and relationships, thank you all for coming and sharing this with us. And please share some wine and cheese outside the door.
history.